The reigning champions went down by 19 runs to the hosts in Pallekele. BBC News.
This is BBC Radio 4. Eric Hobsbawm, who died today at the age of 95, was one of our greatest historians. And in a change to our schedule now, there's another chance to hear an interview recorded in February this year for Archive on 4, in which Simon Schama met Eric Hobsbawm to reflect on his extraordinary life and work. Hobsbawm, A Life in History.
I still believe in the old values of the 18th century Enlightenment, in reason, in education, in the improvement, if not the perfectibility of human beings, and in the attempts, at any rate, to establish liberty, equality, fraternity, or life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness, or any of these other marvellous slogans which we owe to the late 18th century.
Eric Hobsbawm heard there on Desert Island Discs in 1995, making a case for Enlightenment values. Born in Alexandria in 1917, months before the Russian Revolution, he had a turbulent childhood in Vienna and Berlin before coming to England and to Cambridge, where he became a historian. He is president of Birkbeck College and still writing. His latest book, How to Change the World, published in 2011, is a collection of essays passionately making the case for the importance of Marxism today. I first registered the hard force of Eric's analytical approach to history when I read The Age of Revolution at school, the first volume in his epic series that would describe with unparalleled penetration the rise of modernity. I met Eric Hobsbawm at his Hampstead home, a house filled with shelves of books and works of art redolent of the kind of intellectual engagement characteristic of his generation. And I began by confronting him with something of a character assassination. Listen to this, then. Eric John Ernest Hobsbawm, a tall, angular, dangly, ugly, fair-haired fellow of 18 and a half, has no sense of morality, thoroughly selfish. Some people find him extremely disagreeable, others likeable, yet others, the majority, just ridiculous. He wants to be a revolutionary, but so far shows no talent for organisation. He wants to be a writer, but without energy and the ability to shape the material. He hasn't got the faith that will move the necessary mountains, only hope. He is vain and conceited. He is a coward. He loves nature deeply, and he forgets the German language. Do you remember who wrote that?
Yes, I do. In fact, in those days, when I came to England, when I made enormous efforts not to forget either the German language or the extraordinary experiences that I'd had in Berlin, I wrote diaries in German. And I kept them up during a period when I didn't really quite know where I was going, and stopped them more or less when I got to Cambridge. Took them up from time to time later on, but not persistently. And I thought I was trying to be honest with myself.
Well, what do you think the young man, the teenager really, who wrote that account of yourself would think of the life you've had?
Well, the first thing that I thought when I came to England, frankly, England was an enormous bore. After the extraordinary excitement of living in Germany, not merely in the political explosions and earthquakes of 1931-33, but also at a time when I had just ceased to be a child and had become both intellectually, sexually and so on, a teenager. Tried to explain it in school to my English school fellows many years later. I said, supposing you were a journalist who had been reporting on Manhattan, and your editor said, now from tomorrow you'll be getting to Omaha. That's how I felt when I came to England, you see.
Well, Eric, here's a memory. You in your schoolroom in Vienna during a visit in 1996.
Oh, and here we have a primitive example of political consciousness, 13-year-old. Pfui Hitler, down with Hitler. Then 5-pointed stars and 6-pointed star too, the Mogen David. I don't know what one reads into it. I didn't regard myself as being particularly politically developed at that stage, but there you are. Clearly something was happening.
And I wondered, actually, since you did thereafter live through the rise of Nazi dictatorship, whether the fact that you were living something you understood was so historically profound at the time. Clearly, the young Eric knew that this was a kind of one of those fulcrum shifts in world history. That was going to make you a historian of modern times, really.
No, I don't think it made me a historian of modern times. It made me a historian. I suppose the time in my childhood in Vienna prepared me a little bit for the later development. After all, it was a highly political atmosphere. It was also, in some sense, a culturally critical atmosphere. But what we did know is the specifics of Viennese culture, and then particular writers, playwrights. The great Nestroy, who was a cynical comedy writer and popular, saying the extraordinary man, absolutely extraordinary. The man who once claimed that the thing was to see how far the peninsula of the possible could be pushed out into the seas of the impossible. And Karl Kraus, the great critic through whom I, as it were, looked back to the Habsburg Empire, because it was his great work, The Last Days of Humanity, which was first published in 1922. My mother and her sister were, of course, great Kraus admirers and had first editions, which I read, and through which I, so to speak, recovered the sense of what it had been like in and before 1914, and the extraordinary sense that you had to be critical, culturally open-minded, and a good hater.
This play, which by earthly standards would take 10 evenings to perform, is meant for a theatre on Mars. Earthly audiences could not bear it, for it is blood of their blood, and its contents are the contents of those unreal, incomprehensible years beyond the reach of conscious memory, which live on only in nightmares where clowns act out the tragedy of man. The action, running through 100 scenes and 100 hells, is improbable, disjointed, and hero-less. The events shown in this play, no matter how unlikely, actually took place. The words spoken in this play, no matter how unlikely, are true quotations. News reports stand up as people, and people wither into editorials. Clichés walk around on 2 legs while men are having theirs shot off. Anyone with weak nerves, even if you were strong enough to live through the period, had better leave the theatre. War is a disgrace, but the greater disgrace is that some refuse to hear about it.
The prologue from Karl Kraus's satirical drama, The Last Days of Humanity, read by John Franklin Robbins from a radio documentary on Karl Kraus and his Vienna. What I want to ask you about is, you did indeed have this extraordinarily rich but slightly insecure childhood. Your parents died when you were very young, and they were very young. Mother in her 30s, father in his 40s. Yeah. Here from the same Arena program in 1996, you're visiting your parents' graves.
God knows, probably a flat thing which is deep under the earth now.
What do you remember about the grave?
For God's sake, I remember the exact opposite to what it is now, overgrown. It was in fact naked. Nothing there. Well, 1929, 1931, 1934, parents and grandmother. Somewhere down below here.
Would you like ever to be buried there?
No. I'm an ex-Viennese, not a Viennese. Nobody left in the family. Yes.
Yes, and you again, you write very movingly, but with a lot of sobriety about being left without parents. I mean, the impression was a very brave, tough, brave child, I would say.
Well, it clearly was a difficult childhood. I don't think I felt it. I felt deeply attached to my mother. The main reason, for instance, why I didn't change my name, I didn't take the option at the age of 13 of disclaiming religion, all that kind of stuff, is because my mother said you must do nothing at all that might suggest ever, under any circumstances, that you're ashamed of being Jewish.
I cannot imagine you as Eric Hobsbawm, I have to say, actually. That would be a completely different person.
Well, actually, I was, you see, because both in Austria and in Berlin, I was officially the Engländer. And to some extent, I wasn't the Jude, you see. This probably was known, but, I mean, I was covered by being primarily the Englishman, and therefore had no particular experience of anti-Semitism there. But I was deeply attached to my mother. I clearly did much to forget my father. I don't quite know why.
And then they were after they died, then you were suddenly finding yourself in Berlin. Do say something about how formative that was for you.
I found Berlin thrilling. Childhood in Vienna was childhood. It just happened that it was childhood, as it were, in the ruins of a civilization which could not be reconstructed and which would be followed by something, if anything, quite unknown. When my relatives talked about normal times, they said in Frieden, in peacetime. What they meant is before 1914. Since 1914, there's no longer peace. So, in a sense, I sort of got used to a sort of provisional life, and it was a preparation for the sense that one got very much during the Great Depression and in Berlin of a society going to pieces without the option of any return to the past. This was a very Central European experience. I don't think people in England had it, which is one reason why I didn't feel at all comfortable in England. They didn't, so to speak, grasp this extraordinary end-of-the-world atmosphere. But in Berlin, you had it. Only you thought you had to do something about it.
After the death of his parents, Eric, along with his sister, was sent to live with relatives in Berlin. It was, as he told Michael Ignatieff of The Late Show, an extraordinary time to be alive.
I've been conscious of, as it were, living in history for a very long time, but that is essentially because at a crucial stage, you know, when I was, whatever it is, a young teenager, I was lucky enough to live in Berlin just in the last years when Hitler came to power. And if you don't feel that you are part of world history at that time, you never will.
Yeah.
So you're in Berlin, and this in all sorts of ways was, apart from being the most dramatic time, to be there was also very important for you in crystallizing your historical and political philosophy. Yeah, I mean, did you think much actually about Marxism as an intellectual system, or was it just a matter of joining a group that would resist the onset of fascism?
No, I mean, that period in Berlin shaped my life. Without this, I simply wouldn't be what I am now. It was one of the masters at school who, in fact, turned me into a Marxist, and I explained to him that I was a communist and we needed a revolution. And he asked me a few questions and said, "You clearly have no idea what you're talking about. Kindly go to the school library and see what you can find." And then I discovered the Communist Manifesto. And that was it. The first.
It's a good read, I have to say.
What?
It's a good read of all the things that Marx
Can you
wrote.
imagine at the age of 15 reading the Communist first few pages? And I said, "This is it."
You say at one point, and no one's going to forget this, that apart from sex, the most physically intense experience you could have is actually being part of a kind of group demonstration together, and it's a natural thing. I was part of the CND movement in the
That is what I
1960s.
discovered in Berlin, but it's not a specific Berlin experience. It's one that everybody that has become politically impassioned sooner or later has. You must have had it in 68.
Before that, with CND in my case.
With
More like
CND,
1960,
exactly.
61, Aldermaston March.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, that's. But the fact is that one was not alone. And the fact one was not waiting. The fact is one was doing something. Even though I don't believe that we expected to win.
When do you think you realised that? Or very late? I mean, before the Reichstag fire, or before the...
Oh, certainly before the Reichstag fire, but it was perfectly clear that they had taken over and taken power. I think the communists in Germany had curious illusions. They hadn't, for instance, it turned out, they hadn't prepared very effectively for what clearly happened immediately, namely they were turned illegal, and they more or less allowed themselves to be broken up, killed off, put into camps over the next few years. I was only involved in the very early stages of this, very marginally, because the duplicator for our organization, they said, store it in your bedroom because you're not German, you know.
As a printer...
Yes, well, it
like
was those very
machine
primitive duplicators,
yes,
you know.
That was quite dangerous, really, wasn't it?
Yes.
Who knew about it other than you?
If my Uncle Sidney and Gretel had been in Berlin, none of this would have happened. They wouldn't have allowed me to go ahead and practice politics on my own, as it were. But the aunt who took us over, who's trying very hard to make ends meet, we used to live very largely on a bag of potatoes, which she kept down at the bottom, and she had other things to think of, and therefore left her charges more or less free to do what they wanted. And then, I can't remember, I mean, when we stopped having our meetings, but we were still active in the election campaign, the last election campaign, going around distributing material, which to some extent gave the thrill of cowboys and Indians, but you actually knew it was much more than that. It was genuinely dangerous.
In 1935, Eric Hobsbawm won a scholarship to Cambridge. As a young man, Eric was hugely influenced by the Annales school, named for Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre's review of the Annales d'Histoire économique et sociale, the Annals of Economic and Social History, which broke radically with traditional historiography. Alongside colleagues such as E.P. Thompson and Christopher Hill, he founded the social history journal Past and Present. It had a strong left-wing tinge to it, but even for those of us who didn't go along with the doctrine, it was clear that this approach to history opened up extraordinarily exciting, fresh analyses of social behaviour. Do you think that sort of special combination, the Annales had its moment in a way, and I'm not sure the moment is still there, and then one thinks in the 60s of particularly Marxist influenced or left-wing influenced historical writers like Christopher Hill and E.P. Thompson, which whatever one thinks of in the end of what they contributed, were extraordinary writers as well as researchers, hard-headed, but all, had their almost lyrical moments of writing. Certainly true of I always think of Edward Thompson as a kind of Marxist romantic in a way.
Yeah.
Do you think that package of skills, the storytelling and hard analysis, is around today, or has that come and gone?
Well, I think I belong, undoubtedly, I've had the luck to belong to a generation which transformed the teaching of history and the practice of history. Essentially, it was by trying to fertilize traditional history, historical and institutional narrative, by marrying it to or getting inspiration from the social sciences. In the 1930s and 40s, the new generation went for this, and after the war we won. Through the Annal, through, in a much more modest way, past and present, which was a sort
not that much more modest. It was a huge moment for young undergraduates.
Well,
like
the point is it was much more modest because it had no institutional backing. What it did have is the backing of giving an opening to the new historians who wanted to do things which they didn't want to put into the English Historical Review or wouldn't get accepted. In England, the important element in it, though not the only one, was the Communist Party Historians Group, which contained quite a few very talented people, but also all sorts of people outside who were drawn into this kind of social, come intellectual, come structural history.
But there was something about, I just wanted to get your sense, if you have one, of what's become of that project. Now, the great thing about Past and Present as Annal, and that was intoxicating to me in the 60s, was, as you say, if you wanted to not do just causes of wars and treaties and revolutions, you were in the world of the Economic History Review, and they too had a very formal, structured, what produced the Industrial Revolution, what produced the depressions of the 1870s. Suddenly, nothing was off the table. You could write a history of food. You could write a history of, I remember Natalie Davis's wonderful, very long article on the Renaissance charivari, festivals, that sort of thing. The whole of human behaviour, encyclopedically, was actually up for historical vision. Do you think that's survived now? Because, the best sellers around are another biography of Churchill, another account of D-Day, not necessarily in the university world, but have we lost something of that ability to make spellbinding weave of stories out of the social reality of
No, I don't think it's been lost. But what I think got lost, particularly since the 1970s, were some of the, so to speak, basic commandments of good history. I mean, above all, the fact that history is about change, and a change how we started off in the caves or leaving Africa and ended up now. Then I think one of the things that tended to get lost is the sense of difference, which is basic, between fact and fiction, between what actually happened and that there was something that actually happened, and what either didn't happen or what we would have liked to happen. It's difficult to combine asking questions about history and narrative. And it's true that narrative is absolutely essential because time is the essence. What happens and what happens before and what happens after is absolutely central. Without chronology, there can be no history. And you have to know this, even as you ask the questions and set out to answer them. Well, now, the other thing that I think has developed in the past 30, 40 years is much nastier, and that is, you might say, the development of identity history, which largely amounts to identity mythology, which nationalism or ethnic is the most dangerous, because it covers, politically the most dangerous. And in fact, we've had some of the worst political results being won by people who take over new countries as professional historians, as in Georgia and in Croatia, you see, and therefore try and impose an essentially mythological view of things. And that poses a new responsibilities on historians. What they need is skepticism, even of eyewitness reports of themselves. But what they do need, especially today, past few years, is to be militant against the mythologization, and particularly the mythologization by governments and politicians.
In an interview with Kirsty Walk, you were asked about whether or not you considered politicians essentially a particular danger to which historians ought to be alert.
If historians can actually aid our understanding of the present, do you think that George Bush, or for that matter Tony Blair, consulted any history books before they decided to topple Saddam?
No, of course not. I doubt whether George Bush can read. If so, he doesn't read history. And Tony Blair isn't much of a reader either. But the point is, did they consult the people who knew about the areas into which they went? Almost certainly not. Would it have been better if they had? Almost certainly yes. But the point is, about people like Tony Blair, the difference between them and historians is this. Historians say, weapons of mass destruction, are they are not, is a matter of finding out evidence. Can be proved. Was Iraq a major danger? You can argue about it, but in the light of what you know about the situation. What you can't do is you say, I sincerely believe, because sincere belief in the matter is neither here nor there, and is not something that a historian can believe, can use. It's not one of our tools.
That has to be absolutely right as an historian's credo, but as the historian's credo as an activist historian, one thinks of Thucydides really as an activist historian preaching against the dangers of Athenian imperial overreach. I want to ask you two things apropos of this. One is really about the nature of the academic life in which most historians operate and have extreme difficulty or are very demure, for whatever reasons, in my view, about stepping outside academia to really challenge moments like the Iraq moment. And second thing is, you always speak like, and this informs your Marxism, like an Enlightenment historian, really. And we're living in an increasingly a world rather hostile to Enlightenment skepticism, a world surprisingly dominated by nationalist and religious mythologies. So the two questions are, one, do you think that's true, that we're living in a world that would have horrified the philosophe and continues to kind of horrify those of us with a philosophical 18th century bent? And two, is it more incumbent than ever that historians step outside the sort of decorum of historical conferences to do what they must when situations like this arise?
Well, it's certainly essential, like the famous French scholar Ernest Renan said, for historians to become a danger to nationalists. Historians, like anybody in the learned professions, scientists, operate through reason and evidence, through imagination too, through fantasy sometimes, but controlled. It has to be controlled in last analysis. But I think this has to go on. It's not likely to go on because basically the model of intellectual activity, particularly in the past 50 years, has been that of the natural sciences and mathematics, whereas the humanities are somehow other marginal. I think that's a mistake. You have to understand how people work and think, which is not necessarily done by a reductionist problem-solving approach which becomes standard in the natural sciences.
And yet that's what's taught in schools now. If there are any casualties of the pressures of time in state schools, in this country in particular, it is on the humanities, isn't it?
Yes, it is on the humanities.
So we should be fighting harder for exactly the practical purposes that you describe, the understanding of the way in which the human, what humans are capable of doing to each other.
The problem isn't that rationalism or even the values of enlightenment will disappear. The problem is that they're being marginalized. They're largely marginalized by people using the byproducts and not the thinking.
For Eric, being a historian has been inseparable from being a teacher.
Essentially, most of the stuff I wrote was for students to read. Indeed, my original writings were very largely tried out as lectures on students. So that has certain advantages, and the main advantage is that you have to try and be interesting and clear. I used to take the test in Birkbeck, which was an evening college, that people who had done a day's work and then come to college and had their something to eat and then done 2 lectures, and I was doing the 8 to 9 o'clock lecture. Could I keep them interested? And that was a test.
A test I think Eric passed with flying colours. For an example of his ability to explain and engage, just listen to this from In Our Time.
Football today represents both the mass identification with a particular nation or state and the extremes of globalization. Yeah? After all, probably the one way in which most people try and envisage what it means to be English, Scots, Welsh, Nigerian, Benin or something is through their team. And at the same time, as we know, economically speaking, the football industry is absolutely typical of the modern development of global capitalism, you see, in which in fact teams, particular teams, which are to some extent in conflict with the national aspect of football, are recruited from people anywhere in the world, moving around the world anywhere, developing exactly the same extraordinary inequalities of power and wealth. Now, in effect, this seems to me typical of the situation of globalization. We have both at the same time. We have both international competition and through mechanisms which are purely global, which have nothing to do with it, which to some extent even undermine it. That seems to me to be the essence of the problem.
There's a fear, Richard Heavens, that I enjoyed that football analogy. But a lot of people did.
Eric's work has not been confined to history. Under the pseudonym Francis Newton, he's written memorably on jazz. I certainly can never forget his description of listening to Billie Holiday singing Strange Fruit as rather like watching a man amputate his own leg without benefit of anaesthetic. Another of your passions has been jazz, simply that. You describe rather movingly at one point that rock and roll murdered jazz after the war. Did that have to be? And say something about how you first became passionate and also a wonderful writer. Those of you listening to this and haven't read Francis Newton as a great jazz writer should do so right away.
Well, actually, jazz was the first thing that reconciled me to Great Britain. Because that's when I discovered it. So I managed to see Duke Ellington in 1933.
Where was that? Do you remember? Where was he
at the Strettum Astoria, playing what was called a breakfast dance, playing all night for dance. We were sitting there, sneering at the dancers. What?
Did you dance yourself?
No.
Oh, you didn't?
No, I didn't. We were sneering at the dancers, listening to the great sounds which came out, you know. I talked myself into a job on the grounds that official culture had just become aware at this taste of the young provincial wild men, and they'd been hiring Kingsley Amis to write about it. And I said, I know at least as much as Kingsley Amis about it. And then I managed actually to get to the United States and actually saw it at the period of its probably greatest success, just at the end of the 50s, before it broke up into various minority groups.
But then it became, there was a very cerebral moment, really, where, do you think partly the kind of fierceness of this experimental moment in jazz was partly responsible for making it less immediate to the kids like me?
No. The thing is, it was always a relatively minority taste. I think the thing started when the artists themselves stopped being willing to just be entertainers who knew their business, and started to become self-conscious artists. I think
you felt that about Duke Ellington particularly, didn't you?
Well, Duke Ellington...
Like the big orchestral suites and something.
Yes, but I mean, Duke Ellington was a pro, and Duke Ellington worked with people like Ben Webster, who said, my real ambition was to be a successful pimp until I discovered I could blow the horn. What? They didn't think that they were apostles.
What impact has the Cuban Revolution really made on Latin America?
I think it's produced both inspiration and confusion. It taught a good many people in Latin America that a struggle for power was possible and could succeed. And to this extent, of course, it stimulated a great many people. But it also, I think, led them grossly to overestimate the ease with which power could be seized and to underestimate the difficulties, including the pure technical capacity and qualifications needed to do this kind of job. I don't think the Cubans can be themselves blamed for the division among these movements, including guerrilla movements. There was a split between the Russians and Chinese, and indeed at a certain stage the Cubans were really rather anxious to get everybody in on the guerrilla side. But I think the Cubans can be blamed for not deliberately necessarily encouraging a sort of mad voluntarism, the belief that all you have to do is to get a few brave young men with machine guns to rush into the hills and everything else will happen. In a curious way, I speak as a historian, so much of the Guevara epoch reminds me of the Mazzini age of Italy in the 1850s, where one after another little expeditions of young men were sent. In the end, one of these little expeditions paid off, Garibaldi's, to Sicily. But quite frankly, this doesn't retrospectively legitimate the innumerable earlier fiascos. In this instance, I fear the Sicilian expedition came first and the fiascos came after.
Eric speaking there on Radio 4 in 1970 on the Cuban Revolution. My own favourite work of Eric's is his 1959 book on bandits, primitive rebels. The study of peasant revolutionaries brought him to Latin America, a much-neglected region upon which Eric has shed invaluable light. Eric has said that nobody who discovers South America can resist this region, and they too have taken Eric to heart. Today his work is well known, and Brazil is in fact the largest market for his books.
As a professional, I've had a few ideas which have stimulated people. They haven't all been good ideas, but that isn't important. For instance, I invented the historiography of bandits. I wrote one thing about this many years ago, which has been taken up. There's now a huge library of people writing the history of bandits, all of them starting off with my chapter. Now, I think I can safely say that practically all of them are now disagree with me and thought I was wrong. And yet, you see, it is some positive thing to dig out some idea which people will take up, even if they end up by saying it's no good. And I think I must, in some sense, have written history which was not regarded purely as of local interest, because it's fairly clear that, for instance, there are parts of the world, such as Latin America, which have taken to my stuff, but largely because it seems to be aware of those parts of the world too, you see, and not just of the West. When I first went to Latin America, I wanted to carry on with the kind of research I'd done in Primitive Rebels about how ordinary people think of politics in the eras before the invention of the modern state and the modern vocabulary and the modern instrumentarium for dealing with these things. And you needed to be able to talk to, say, some peasants. And in Latin America you could.
It's easy to forget that for much of the 20th century, the political landscape looked very different. Around 1/3 of the world's population lived under communism, so Marxists, like Eric, had rather different hopes. For a BBC television discussion in 1964, celebrating 100 years of Marxism, Eric was asked for his predictions.
The one last question that I want to put to all of you, based on the kind of analysis that you've been putting forward, what do you think is the future line of development of communism in the countries that we've been talking about? Hannon.
Well, I think that in Africa, the position is that all the regimes that have been established by the colonial powers when they left a few years ago, in some cases a good many years ago in others, all of these regimes are necessarily temporary. The people who are running the country are the chaps who rose to political eminence while the colonial power was there. We haven't yet had a purely local form of leadership in a non-colonial context. Hence, all these regimes are on trial. The question is, will the challenge from the professional revolutionaries trained in China and in Cuba, will this challenge provoke any sort of response among other people in these countries who feel that they're left out? Will there in fact be a series of revolutions like the one in Zanzibar?
Yes. Harris.
I see communism surviving in China, Vietnam, Korea. I see communism elsewhere becoming more nationalist, more diffuse, and over a period of time developing into the kind of doctrinal position that the average Social Democratic Party is now in. I don't see communism as we have known it surviving in any strength in South Asia, and I wouldn't have thought in Africa either. It'll be the means of revolution possibly, but it won't be the doctrine which will survive to direct the kind of government you get.
Hobsbawm.
I don't agree with Harris that certain peoples or parts of the world are, as it were, predestined for communism and others aren't. I think there will be a good many social revolutions in the world because, we've seen it in that film of yours, there's plenty of revolutionary material. I think some of them, perhaps only a minority, will be made by communist parties, Russian or Chinese. But I think that won't necessarily exhaust the possibilities of communism and Marxism, because of something which hasn't been mentioned so far, namely the practical importance, both in Russia, in China and elsewhere, of this peculiar model, what the Webbs used to call the vocation of leadership, of the communist, the Bolshevik type of party. And what we may well see, as in Cuba, is that after the revolutions have been made, the practical advantages of this particular form of social organization will increasingly make themselves felt.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
Bit optimistic. Yeah.
The question of why you stayed in the Communist Party has not gone away, of course, and everybody who's ever interviewed you has asked you this, and sometimes it's necessarily a bit of an uncomfortable subject. There was the moment when Sue Lawley asked you that question on Desert Island Discs.
And if you'd known the terrible things that were taking place in the Soviet Union at that time in the name of communism, terrible indiscriminate suffering and mass murder, would you still have remained loyal?
Well, in the first place, we didn't know. We didn't know the extent of it. In the second place, insofar as people told us, we didn't believe them. Didn't want to believe them, perhaps. We didn't believe them.
So you're saying that such was your commitment and your dedication that if there was a chance of bringing about this communist utopia, which was your dream, it was worth any kind of sacrifice?
Yes, I think so.
Even the sacrifice of millions of lives?
Well, that's what we felt when we fought World War II, didn't we?
Isn't there a difference between killing someone in war and killing your own?
We didn't know that. Dead is dead.
Shall we have record number 3?
Would you rather this question just stopped and went away, really? And you have said sometimes that it was partly because fainter hearts, really, I'm sure you didn't use that phrase, all left the party, that you had a certain kind of tenacious determination to stay.
I think the question should go away, and virtually has gone away. It's a Cold War question that is asked in Western Europe and the United States. Nobody, if I ever go to Latin America or to India or to a lot of other things, ever asks me that question. It's not relevant to them.
Why are people obsessed with it here in the United States, do you think? Well,
they are obsessed because they try to live in a period of a zero-sum game. It's an irrelevant question. Ask it again if you like, and I'll say, the hell with you. That's what I've been. Find your own reasons. And I have managed to live with it and do my stuff. Spent most of my life hoping for the success of something which turned out not to work. But it was a great cause. I still think it's a great cause. And I would be happier if the people that accuse people like me, that people like me should have beaten our breasts about the bad things that happened, if the people who did this beat their breasts about the bad things that happened on their watch.
Fair enough. Can we say, because the great cause, as you've said, hasn't worked out as you'd hoped, when you took it on. But we're living now, I have to ask this, at a time when a lot of what Marx had to say about overproduction and the self-destructive nature of capitalism has manifestly actually come about. And yet, really, the attraction, actually, of Marxist and socialist way of looking things weirdly has not come back exactly at the time when you might expect that it might have had a new power right now. On the contrary, the most unreconstructed, laissez-faire, fundamentalist view of free market capitalism, notwithstanding its implosion, seems to have won the day in an extraordinary way. Does that, give you pause? Does that surprise you? It certainly surprises me, I have to say.
Well, let's get one thing clear. Marx has been enormously powerful as an analysis of what is happening under capitalism, but inevitably not very good at analyzing the possible alternatives. The eventual globalization of the world economy, which indeed he had predicted vividly, removed their essential tool, which was that of national governments that could be pressured into financing and bringing about these reforms. So I don't see any real difficulty in combining praise of Marxism as a way of understanding what is happening today with skepticism about traditional Marxism, the traditional left-wing policies about how to get out of it, because nobody knows.
It's easy to assume that with the passing of Marxist powers and states, Eric's own work has become history. But nothing is further from the truth. He has always been a clear-eyed analyst of the ways in which societies generate and respond to social injustice and exploitation. And with the meltdown of capitalism in our own time and the punishing costs inflicted on ordinary people, that approach could not be more relevant to understanding our own times historically. In the end, it's Eric Hobsbawm's grip on the nature of human behaviour, his anatomy of economic muscle, of the force of ideology, written across cultures, continents and centuries, that makes it certain to me that the work of Eric Hobsbawm will endure.
We are gradually getting used, you see, to living under conditions which in the days of our parents, my parents or grandparents, would have been regarded as intolerable. And so, what is darkness? You see, everybody thinks a catastrophe is something which happens from one day to the next, like a big earthquake or something like this. But what we are not easily getting used to is a slow-motion catastrophe, such as we can see happening in large parts of Africa today. It is possible for human life to go on and people adjusting themselves to living in the sort of conditions in which people have been living for 20 years in Angola and Mozambique, for whatever it is, 10 years or more in Somalia, for 5 or 6 years in Liberia and a number of other places. No doubt in some way or other, something like life on the basis of being nasty, brutish and short can nevertheless become regularized again. And yet, looking at it from where we stand, and looking at it not only from our hopes, but from the experience. After all, living in Liberia or Mozambique, even in the early 1970s, or Somalia, was different. Living in Tajikistan was different. It wasn't ideal, it was even bad, but I mean, it was better than what there is now. And I think when to say darkness, doesn't mean that we shall all kind of commit suicide. It means we shall get used to living under conditions which should not be tolerated.
I asked Eric whether he has much hope for the future.
We live at a time when not many people are very optimistic about the future, at least in the West, with good reasons. Am I? I think the great Italian thinker Gramsci once said, what you need is a combination of pessimism of the intelligence and optimism of the will. Well, I'm too old to be involved in the optimism of the will bit anymore. So what remains is pessimism of the intelligence, and therefore I don't look forward to the next 20, 30, 40 years with much hope. Although sooner or later I think if we manage to avoid some major environmental catastrophe, we should manage to stabilize the world again.
Let me ask you a final question. You've had a long, incredibly productive, creative life, very dramatic life in a way, and we hope there'll be many, many more years, a lot more life to go. But is there anything, looking back, that you would like to have done? Played jazz yourself, whatever that you haven't done, and because there's still time to do it. But or have you really had the life that young boy who wrote that excessively honest account of himself had thought he might do?
I didn't set out to achieve anything for myself, although it turned out I was reasonably good at what I was doing. It turned out that after a first go and a few years of acute unhappiness, I built up a very nice life with a family and all the rest of it, which we hope to celebrate our golden wedding this year.
Congratulations.
But I can't say, as I wasn't setting out to produce anything, that I fell short. What I wanted to do is for the world to change. The world did not change in the way in which I had hoped, and to that extent I'm disappointed. Not much I could have done about it. What I've achieved, this is a peculiar business. I've managed, I think, to try and talk about all history together, seeing how politics and the arts and ordinary life and economics and whatever, how it hangs together at any particular period, and to do so in a readable fashion. And somehow or other, I've also managed to act as a sort of public intellectual, and somebody not only who kept the flag flying, but who showed that by waving it you can actually achieve something, if only good and readable books.
Eric Hobsbawm, who died today, speaking to Simon Schama for Archive on 4, in a programme first broadcast in April this year. Hobsbawm, A Life in History was presented by Simon Schama and produced by Jessica Treen. And that programme replaced the scheduled programmes The Material World and Start the Week, which you can hear on the Radio 4 website. Now, a quick look at the weather forecast for tomorrow. It'll be a rather unsettled day for most, with scattered heavy showers or longer spells of rain in the west. Brighter conditions are expected in the east, but there will be some heavy showers around too, some more persistent rain arriving here later in the evening. On 92 to 95 FM, 198 longwave and digital radio, this is BBC Radio 4.
You understood was so historically profound at the time, clearly. The young Eric knew that this was a kind of one of those fulcrum shifts in world history. That was going to make you a historian of modern times, really.
No, I don't think it made me a historian of modern times. It made me a historian. I suppose the time in my childhood in Vienna prepared me a little bit for the later development. After all, it was a highly political atmosphere. It was also, in some sense, a culturally critical atmosphere. But what we did know is the specifics of Viennese culture, and then particular writers, playwrights. The great Nestroy, who was a cynical comedy writer and popular, saying the extraordinary man, absolutely extraordinary. The man who once claimed that the thing was to see how far the peninsula of the possible could be pushed out into the seas of the impossible. And Karl Kraus, the great critic through whom I, as it were, looked back to the Habsburg Empire, because it was his great work, The Last Days of Humanity, which was first published in 1922. My mother and her sister were, of course, great Kraus admirers and had first editions, which I read, and through which I, so to speak, recovered the sense of what it had been like in and before 1914. And the extraordinary sense that you had to be critical, culturally open-minded, and a good hater.
This play, which by earthly standards would take 10 evenings to perform, is meant for a theatre on Mars. Earthly audiences could not bear it, for it is blood of their blood, and its contents are the contents of those unreal, incomprehensible years beyond the reach of conscious memory, which live on only in nightmares where clowns act out the tragedy of man. The action, running through 100 scenes and 100 hells, is improbable, disjointed, and hero-less. The events shown in this play, no matter how unlikely, actually took place. The words spoken in this play, no matter how unlikely, are true quotations. News reports stand up as people, and people wither into editorials. Clichés walk around on 2 legs while men are having theirs shot off. Anyone with weak nerves, even if you were strong enough to live through the period, had better leave the theatre. War is a disgrace, but the greater disgrace is that some refuse to hear about it.
The prologue from Karl Kraus's satirical drama, The Last Days of Humanity, read by John Franklin Robbins from a radio documentary on Karl Kraus and his Vienna. What I want to ask you about is, you did indeed have this extraordinarily rich but slightly insecure childhood. Your parents died when you were very young, and they were very young. Mother in her 30s, father in his 40s.
Yeah.
Here from the same Arena programme in 1996, you're visiting your parents' graves.
The reigning champions went down by 19 runs to the hosts in Pallekele. BBC News.
This is BBC Radio 4. Eric Hobsbawm, who died today at the age of 95, was one of our greatest historians. And in a change to our schedule now, there's another chance to hear an interview recorded in February this year for Archive on 4, in which Simon Schama met Eric Hobsbawm to reflect on his extraordinary life and work. Hobsbawm, A Life in History.
I still believe in the old values of the 18th century Enlightenment, in reason, in education, in the improvement, if not the perfectibility of human beings, and in the attempts, at any rate, to establish liberty, equality, fraternity, or life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness, or any of these other marvellous slogans which we owe to the late 18th century.
Eric Hobsbawm, heard there on Desert Island Discs in 1995, making a case for Enlightenment values. Born in Alexandria in 1917, months before the Russian Revolution, he had a turbulent childhood in Vienna and Berlin before coming to England and to Cambridge, where he became a historian. He is president of Birkbeck College and still writing. His latest book, How to Change the World, published in 2011, is a collection of essays passionately making the case for the importance of Marxism today. I first registered the hard force of Eric's analytical approach to history when I read The Age of Revolution at school, the first volume in his epic series that would describe with unparalleled penetration the rise of modernity. I met Eric Hobsbawm at his Hampstead home, a house filled with shelves of books and works of art redolent of the kind of intellectual engagement characteristic of his generation. And I began by confronting him with something of a character assassination. Listen to this, then. Eric John Ernest Hobsbawm, a tall, angular, dangly, ugly, fair-haired fellow of 18 and a half, has no sense of morality, thoroughly selfish. Some people find him extremely disagreeable, others likeable, yet others, the majority, just ridiculous. He wants to be a revolutionary, but so far shows no talent for organisation. He wants to be a writer, but without energy and the ability to shape the material. He hasn't got the faith that will move the necessary mountains, only hope. He is vain and conceited. He is a coward. He loves nature deeply, and he forgets the German language. Do you remember who wrote that?
Yes, I do. In fact, in those days, when I came to England, when I made enormous efforts not to forget either the German language or the extraordinary experiences that I'd had in Berlin, I wrote diaries in German. And I kept them up during a period when I didn't really quite know where I was going, and stopped them more or less when I got to Cambridge. Took them up from time to time later on, but not persistently. And I thought I was trying to be honest with myself.
Well, what do you think the young man, the teenager really, who wrote that account of yourself would think of the life you've had?
Well, the first thing that I thought when I came to England, frankly, England was an enormous bore. After the extraordinary excitement of living in Germany, not merely in the political explosions and earthquakes of 1931-33, but also at a time when I had just ceased to be a child and had become both intellectually, sexually and so on, a teenager. Tried to explain it in school to my English school fellows many years later. I said, supposing you were a journalist who had been reporting on Manhattan, and your editor said, now from tomorrow you'll be getting to Omaha. That's how I felt when I came to England, you see.
Well, Eric, here's a memory. You in your schoolroom in Vienna during a visit in 1996.
Oh, and here we have a primitive example of political consciousness, 13-year-old. Pfui Hitler, down with Hitler. Then 5-pointed stars and 6-pointed star too, the Mogen David. I don't know what one reads into it. I didn't regard myself as being particularly politically developed at that stage, but there you are. Clearly something was happening.
And I wondered, actually, since you did thereafter live through the rise of Nazi dictatorship, whether the fact that you were living something you